Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called 10 FUZAK albums that I can just about tolerate. Okay, so anybody who watches this channel is, I know that I'm not so keen on the FUZAK end of fusion. So what is FUZAK? Well, it's a term I think I've come up with. I don't know if it really exists. It might exist. Anyway, it's a mixture of the words fusion and muzak. FUZAK. Easy listening, polite, jazz FM friendly, instrumental jazz fusion. Okay? When jazz fusion emerges in the early 70s, a lot of that music is pretty heavy. You know, it's a fusion between the cutting edge progressive sounds coming out of rock music and the cutting edge jazz experimental music. You know, something like Bitches Brew that brings in the era of jazz fusion is a pretty difficult album to listen to. The Mahavishnu Orchestra were out there, and these bands, despite sounding like that, sold a ton of records, and the music company jumps on that, and they're really selling these fusion bands in the same way as they're selling Yes and Genesis and King Crimson and, you know, Pink Floyd. It's lumped in with there. Now, as anyone who has studied the history of progressive music knows, in 1976, 1977, punk comes along and really shows up those bands as being very indulgent. But in terms of jazz fusion, disco comes along. Okay? Now, fusion has pioneered a lot of the sounds that you hear in disco music. You know, people like Billy Cobham and Herbie Hancock, the Brecker Brothers. You know, they've all been making fusion very funky, you know, because James Brown was very important. You know, Parliament Funkadelic was very important influence on fusion. And you know, they start selling some records. So when disco hits, disco's almost come out of fusion. And the record companies suddenly turn around and go, wow, there's disco. This is great. Now, anyone who's watched my recent interview with Narada Michael Walden, he goes into detail on this about how he was making fusion. And then suddenly the record companies turn around and say, well, we're going to drop you unless you have a hit record. So all these guys that got really good deals, you know, they're highly trained jazz musicians going, oh my God, I need to get a hit record. Now, in a lot of cases, they start adding vocals. They try and start writing pop hits. That isn't FUZAK. That's something else. I actually quite like a lot of that stuff. Even when it's bad, I find it quite entertaining, you know, listening to, say, someone like Stanley Clarke trying to write a pop record. People like Narada Michael Walden were geniuses at it. They just moved from making heavy fusion to making amazing pop music. But I'm not on about that. I'm not on about the sort of move towards vocal disco music, right? What I'm on about is another type of music that emerges in the 70s, and basically it's taking fusion, taking all the rough edges away, and just pushing forward this nice, polite version of jazz fusion that doesn't ruffle people's feathers too much, and can sit on the radio, and is nice and friendly, easy on the ear. Almost like I always imagined it was sophisticated people would have dinner parties in the late 70s, and when someone would come round, they'd stick on a nice FUZAK album, like background music, you know. There's an Aldi Meola track on Splendido Hotel called Dinner Music for the Gods, and that's out and out fusion. He's making the point, yeah, like we know fusion's become this sort of dinner music, but here it is for the gods. I think he just kicks it all back in, which is great, you know. So I've gone through my collection, and I've pulled out 10 FUZAK albums that I can sort of tolerate. Some of them I like, none of these I hate. Some of them I really like, and it also gives a sort of potted history of FUZAK in terms of my record collection. So the first album I'm going to pull out is this one by Grover Washington. It's actually a best of, the anthology of Grover Washington. So Grover Washington is a great jazz player, fantastic. Towards the mid 70s, he's one of the first musicians to really move over into this FUZAK sound. These are the guys that they're hooking up with that sort of Steve Gadd, Richard T rhythm section, and they start to play on millions and millions of albums. I'm not sure whether Gadd's on here. I imagine he is. Be very surprised if he wasn't. In the 70s, when you listen to 70s FUZAK, because that 80s production hasn't kicked in yet, I could still listen to it and enjoy it because I could hear a real band in the room. Some of the grooves are nice. Yeah, it's very polite, but you can hear the quality of the players. And I like Grover Washington. I think he's great. He did a lot with Bill Withers, and Bill Withers was such a great songwriter. This is a bit off the thing, because here he is, on tracks like Just the Two of Us. I love that tune because it's got a fantastic songwriting from Bill Withers. But this is where it starts. It starts with people like George Benson, with Grover Washington. A whole bunch of musicians are emerging in the mid-70s, and those records are radio friendly. Another jazz fusion group that had a hit record is this one, Spyro Gyra. Right now, they had a hit single called Morning Dance. It was a hit single here in the UK. That came out in 1979. My dad bought that on single. So there's these little bands that exposed me to fusion before I got into it. I've gone through on this channel a whole host of them. Spyro Gyra was also one of those bands, and I loved Morning Dance. And Morning Dance does have such a character to it. I think it's just got this sort of carnival, steel pan vibe to it. If you buy this album, once you get past that track, you get a lot of very high quality sort of disco fusion tracks on there. If I'd have heard this like in the mid-80s when I was into my heavy fusion, I probably wouldn't have liked it, but it's in there because it has a special place in my heart. Spyro Gyra do. This album in particular, my dad loved this album, so I got personal reason for liking this. But again, it's recorded in the 70s, before all that digital technologies and Simmons drums and Obenheim, DX7s and all that stuff could come in and really make it sound absolutely horrible. Right, I'm now going to pull up an absolutely classic FUZAK album that I really do like. It's this one by David Sanborn. I really like David Sanborn. Again, he's such a high quality player. Sanborn, if you really look into the cracks of his career, has actually made a lot of quite avant-garde music. He's a serious musician. Right, the compositions, the tunes are fantastic. I think this is one of the things with FUZAK. If you've got someone who can really write great tunes, right, that will push it into another level. So often there's people, good jazz musicians, but they're not songwriters, and this really is about songwriting when you're trying to make radio-friendly music. But this is an absolute classic. I would say this is probably my favourite FUZAK album. It's absolutely wonderful. And Run for Cover is probably the best FUZAK track, and I absolutely love that. I could listen to that every single day. It features Marcus Miller, and Marcus Miller is also an absolute monster. I haven't pulled any of his albums out, I didn't come across any, but I've got a couple. Marcus Miller is just absolutely fantastic. What makes Marcus and Sanborn so much better than the rest? I think it's hooks. Marcus Miller can write a bass hook, and I think it's the feel and the grooves. I mean, the lineup on this is David Sanborn, Marcus Miller, Tom Scott, another great musician that's done a ton of FUZAK, and Steve Gadd. Although it doesn't say yet, it's definitely Steve Gadd. It just says Run for Cover. Oh yeah, Steve Gadd and Ralph McDonald. Sorry, I'm getting on my eyesight. I need to get some new glasses. Right, yeah. So absolute classic. If my Desert Island FUZAK album would be that. Close behind that is another one I pulled out that I really like, and it's this one. Some people will go, "That's not FUZAK album." I think it is. That's a FUZAK album. Larry Carlton. This is generic of so many albums that were coming out in the late 70s. This is a good album. Larry Carlton is the guitarist. It is all a little bit middle of the road for me. I've got to be honest, but this is just done so well. Same thing, and we've got that lineup of Steve Gadd this time, Abe Laboriel on bass, Carlos Rios on rhythm guitar, Paulino DaCosta. These are the people that really made the best FUZAK. I like this album. Also on this album is the great Jeff Porcaro. Right, some fantastic musicians, absolutely fantastic musicians, and these musicians are also the big session players at the time. They're appearing on Diana Ross and Michael Jackson. All these, the same pool of players are doing the big pop sessions. Whether that makes it good or not, I don't know. It's different to what's going on in the early 70s with jazz fusion. Right. This one is an absolute classic. Another absolute classic. And this one actually in places gets so heavy and out there, I don't know whether I'd fully class it as FUZAK, but Captain Fingers by Lee Ritenour. Lee Ritenour is another guy that went towards FUZAK. There's an album called, I think, is it Rit 2 or Rit 1, where he does a track called Mr. Briefcase. It's an absolute abomination of a track. It's just totally awful. It's people trying to write pop songs that don't understand pop songs. It's absolutely awful. Here, he's fantastic. Incredible guitarist. It's got Harvey Mason's on drums, Victor Feldman, Jeff Beccaro, Ernie Watts, George Duke's on here, Ian Udwood. It's just absolutely fantastic. But on the tracks, Captain Fingers and Space Glide, I would say that is moving towards proper burning fusion. So this is an example of a FUZAK album that's got enough of that burning fusion in there to tip it over. They also do a version of Isn't She Lovely by Stevie Wonder, you know, which is very good. Dave Grusin's written a couple of tunes on here. Dave Grusin with Larry Rosen is going to set up GRP Records, which I will talk about a little bit in a minute when we get to that point. But one more fusion band. So towards the late 70s, we get a whole bunch of fusion bands like the Yellow Jackets, especially FX, a whole bunch of these bands that I've never spoken about on this channel. They're often, when you've got these groups that emerge sort of late 70s, early 80s, the groups are a little bit better. I think the group sound that a lot of these bands have is gives it a little bit more quality, and I want to just pull one album up the way I think that is the case. Jeff Lorber Fusion, Water Sign. This is a good album, and the reason why is that it's the same thing with Lee Ritenour, is that it is burning a little bit. You know, it's not Mahavishnu Orchestra, but they are burning, they are playing. A lot of the problems I have with FUZAK is this sort of, you get this sort of tepid groove coming, there's no real hooks, it's just polite, and then you get a solo that's just been dialed in and never goes anywhere, never burns, and has obviously been lifelessly overdubbed in the studio, you know. And this style really reaches its apex with Kenny G, the dreaded Kenny G. You know, Kenny G has the dubious honour of being the biggest selling jazz musician of all time, but not just the biggest selling, but the biggest selling by a wide margin. You know, so someone like Miles Davis, you know, has made Kind of Blue, which people say is the biggest selling jazz album ever. It's sold a couple of million, I think. When you get to Kenny G, you're in the sort of 30, 40 million. I've done a video on the biggest selling jazz albums of all time, and you'll see it's got a picture of Kenny G on there, so if you want to check that out. But so, yes, going back to Dave Grusin, when I was a kid I used to call him Dave Gruesome, because I knew that if he was on an album I shouldn't buy it, because I knew what I was going to get in on that album, and that would be something that sounded like the soundtrack to an American sitcom or cop show, you know. Now that's a bit unfair, because Tom Scott's theme to Starsky and Hutch is an absolute classic, you know. But Dave Grusin, you know, he originally did the music for The Graduate, for example, and then this type of music that we're talking about became the soundtrack to American television in the 80s, and I find that really difficult. It was, you know, if I made the mistake of buying one of these albums, I was so disappointed. There's many a FUZAK album I've taken back in the 80s and 90s, and the label that was the biggest culprit in the 80s for me was GRP, and that was formed by David Grusin with Larry Rosen. Now, I think GRP started out as a subsidiary for another label, and I can't remember which one it was, but they realised that the jazz they were signing wasn't selling, and so they brought in Dave Grusin and Larry Rosen, who was a music producer and had done a lot of film soundtrack stuff as well, and fusion albums, to sort of take that over, and they recorded a number of artists on that subsidiary, which was GRP. One of them was David Valentin, who was a flute player, and they sold a ton of records, and so they eventually split off and created their own label. Now the reason why GRP had so much success, I think, in the early days, it was because they really nailed the CD market. So in the 80s, everyone was getting into CDs. The record companies, as they always do, didn't move fast enough. Dave Goose and Larry Ross in something like 1976, 77 made the first digital recording. So if you don't remember, every time you bought a GRP album, it would say Digital Master on it, because these albums were recorded digitally and pushed out for a CD market. So many artists I like moved over to there. Billy Cobb moved over, and of course Chick Corea moved over. Now, is this a FUZAK album? I don't think it is. But there it is on GERP. It's one of the most important fusion albums of the 80s. But look at that cover, and there's the Digital Master there. There are definite moments on this album where they're playing FUZAK. A few years before, Chick Corea was signed to ECM, and he was making quite avant-garde free albums like Trio Music, you know, tributes to Thelonious Monk, and then suddenly he signs to GRP and it goes like this, and he ends up looking like that, you know. This is jazz going commercial. I would say that this is bordering on a FUZAK album, but I do really love it. And why? Because Chick Corea is great, you know. When Chick Corea landed on GRP and the Electric Band became such a success, all those artists start to make solo albums. I've talked about this album before, but here's an example I've pulled out yet again. You know, I pulled this out because I do like this. It's very polite. It's very tepid, but they do really play on here. There's some tasty playing, you know. This is always the case with jazz. You know, when you're going towards FUZAK, what's going to make you like it is how tasty the playing is, and so often it just doesn't get out of first gear for me. I've pulled out just two more albums to finish this off. We're going into the 90s now, and we see a legacy of this sort of FUZAK-y approach. And these both of these albums sold a lot. I bought them because everyone bought them. The first is Candy Dulfer, Sexuality. She had a hit with Dave Stewart from the Eurythmics, and so I thought, well, that's interesting. There's a sort of saxophone player in the charts, so I went and bought this album. Now, this album, I can tolerate this album because it's actually very funky, right? This is really coming out of the sort of acid jazz thing that was going on in the late 80s, early 90s. It's off the back of that. Candy Dulfer's not the best saxophone player in the world, without a doubt, but she can package up that idea well. This is a funky album. Now, that's the other thing, you know, sometimes FUZAK can move towards the funky side, and it can actually become really cool funk. I love disco, I love funk. I'm going to pull out all the disco and funk albums I've got one day and show them all, because I really love them. But FUZAK is not that. So, you know, Candy Dulfer's representing, you know, Marcus Miller's a bit like that. Marcus is really funky. David Sanborn's really funky. Basically what I'm saying is I like FUZAK when it's at the edges of what FUZAK should be, when it's right in the middle and it's just very polite dinner music, you know, to sit in the background and not offend anybody. I can't stand it. So this is the last album I pulled out. It's The Antidote by Ronnie Jordan. This too in the UK spawned a hit record, which was a version of So What by Miles Davis. This is really coming out of the sort of acid jazz and other dance music forms. I think this came out around about 92, so it's right in the middle of all that. The late great Ronnie Jordan, he's a sort of Wes Montgomery style player. This is very FUZAK-y, but he's just got that little whiff of acid jazz, funk, dance music, which just pushes it. Now this is where we end this video now, is that FUZAK has been a huge influence, you know. Somebody said, oh, check out this guitarist Matteo Mancuso, who's an incredible young virtuoso jazz guitarist. So I checked out some of his tracks. His guitar playing's incredible, but the music, it's so indebted to FUZAK. It's so polite and derivative. It sounds like a FUZAK track that you would have had come out 40 years ago, right? Snarky Puppy, Dirty Loops, they're all indebted to this style of music. It's really informed what is actually going on today. It also informed acid jazz. A lot of the good FUZAK stuff with the hooks, you know, and the grooves was picked up by acid jazz DJs in the late 80s in the UK that then fed into dance music. It fed into house music. I worked within the house music world, and so often we would go back to some of these classic FUZAK albums for inspiration, you know. So it has had an influence, and it's here to this day. So FUZAK is a thing, right? this video is just me sort of saying, here it is. You know, I've sort of gone through some albums. All those albums are good albums. If you go and check them out, if you don't know them, go and check them out, and you'll hear there's some nice stuff. It's not the Mavish Orchestra. It's not Coltrane. It's not Return to Forever, you know. And it's not Gil Scott Heron, Parliament Funkadelic, or even Earth, Wind and Fire. It's something else. So that's my sort of introduction to the world of FUZAK. You know, I wanted to have a video where I put FUZAK in the title so that anyone watching my videos and I use that term and go, what's Andy on about here? I hope I've sort of introduced to the idea of what FUZAK is, and I'll be getting into it more in the future. Anyway, I think I've got to the end of the video now, so we're done. If you like, if you want to subscribe, please subscribe. And of course, if you want to support me in what I'm doing, go to Patreon and you'll find a ton more videos like this there. Thank you very much.